Good evening, brave souls. I'm Grim. They call me a ghost now, but I was once like you, alive. Tonight, I'll be your companion through the shadows. So, get comfortable, if you're ready. The night has only just begun, and the stories are waiting to be told. It was nearing midnight when John found himself driving down Highway 37, a stretch of road he had been avoiding for years. The long, dark road snaked through endless miles of forest, its bends hidden by towering trees. The highway had a reputation, and not a good one. Rumors about strange disappearances and ghostly apparitions had kept locals off it for decades. But John had no choice. His daughter, Emily, had been in an accident and he needed to get to her. The rain had started about an hour ago, turning the highway into a slick, dangerous path. His windshield wipers slapped back and forth, but the heavy downpour made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. He squinted at the road, gripping the steering wheel tighter as his headlights illuminated only the road's immediate edge before being swallowed by the darkness. Just focus. You'll be there soon, John muttered to himself, trying to shake the growing unease gnawing at him. He flicked the radio on for some company, but static filled the car. No signal, of course. Just as he was about to turn it off, a voice crackled through. "Turn around," a deep, distorted voice whispered from the static. John's hand froze on the knob. His heart pounded, the hairs on his arms standing up. He switched the radio off, his fingers trembling. He told himself it was just a fluke, maybe interference from the storm. The highway was empty, save for his car, and John was starting to regret taking this route. His GPS had rerouted him when a landslide blocked the main highway, and Highway 37 had been his only option. Now, as he drove deeper into the isolated forest, the feeling of being watched settled over him. Suddenly, his headlights flickered. Then they blinked off for a split second before coming back. John's heart skipped a beat. He checked his fuel gauge, full tank. Everything seemed normal, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't go away. He pushed the car a little faster, wanting to get off this cursed road. As he rounded a bend, John's headlights caught something on the side of the road. A figure, tall, gaunt, and cloaked in shadow, stood motionless by the highway's edge. John slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. His heart pounded in his ears as he stared at the figure, its face obscured by the hood of a ragged cloak. "What the hell?" he whispered, trying to get a better look through the rain-soaked windshield. The figure remained perfectly still, almost as if it had been waiting for him. John's pulse quickened. It was too far out in the middle of nowhere for anyone to be standing on the side of the road like that. With his breath caught in his throat, he pressed on the gas and sped past the figure. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the figure had disappeared into the rain. His hands shook on the wheel as the road stretched endlessly ahead of him. He needed to get to Emily, but the miles were passing too slowly. 20 minutes later, John thought he could relax. Maybe the figure had just been a trick of the rain or his overactive imagination. Then, out of nowhere, a loud thump echoed from the roof of his car. John nearly lost control, swerving to the side of the highway before he brought the car to a stop. His breath came in short, rapid gasps. Something, or someone, was on the roof. He sat in silence for a moment, frozen in place. The rain continued to pound the car, but beneath it, he could hear the slow, deliberate scrape of something dragging across the metal roof. "This can't be happening," John muttered, fumbling for his phone. No service. Suddenly, the car rocked, as if something heavy had jumped off the roof. John's heart was racing, his eyes darting around the darkness outside. He reached for the door handle, but something deep inside him screamed not to open it. His hands were slick with sweat. His breathing labored as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Through the rain, something moved, a shadow darting between the trees at the edge of the highway. John's heart leaped into his throat. The figure was back, its hood still drawn low, its movements unnaturally fast. John floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning briefly on the wet road before gaining traction. The car sped down the highway, and the trees blurred by. He didn't care about the speed anymore. He just needed to get out. The road ahead stretched into darkness, endless and consuming. John checked the mirror again. The figure was gone. Relief washed over him, but only for a moment. Without warning, the figure appeared in the middle of the road, directly in his path. John screamed, slamming on the brakes. The tires squealed, and the car swerved violently, narrowly missing the figure. He fought the wheel, pulling the car back under control. His hands ached from the grip he had on the wheel. John pulled over, his chest heaving. His mind raced. Was it all in his head, or was the figure somehow real, haunting him as he sped down the highway? The rain continued to pound the roof, relentless. John stared out into the night, the forest around him eerily still. He couldn't stay here. His phone still had no signal, and the gas station he remembered seeing on the GPS was miles ahead. But he wasn't alone on this highway, and the thought made his skin crawl. As he pulled back onto the road, the figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching him, waiting. John didn't slow down. He pressed the pedal harder, pushing the car faster than he ever had before. He kept his eyes on the road, refusing to look in the rear-view mirror again. A mile later, the flickering glow of a gas station's neon sign appeared through the rain. John's heart leaped. Civilization, finally. He pulled into the lot, his tires squealing on the wet pavement. He leaped out of the car, drenched by the rain, as he ran into the station's small shop. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a stark contrast to the eerie darkness outside. The clerk, a tired-looking man in his 50s, glanced up from his magazine. "Everything okay, buddy?" John leaned on the counter, still trying to catch his breath. There's someone out there on the highway." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "You took Highway 37, didn't you?" John nodded, wiping the rain from his face. The clerk sighed and stood, gesturing toward the road. "People say there's something wrong with that highway. Folks disappear, see things that aren't there. Best to keep moving." John stared out into the night, the rain-soaked highway glistening under the station's lights. The figure was gone, but in the pit of his stomach, John knew he wasn't safe yet. He filled his tank, not daring to look back at the road. As he drove off, leaving the gas station and the cursed highway behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. The road was clear now, but in the shadows of the forest, something unseen still lurked, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to pass through. He only hoped he'd make it to Emily before it caught him. Jake Turner gripped the steering wheel as rain pounded on his windshield like an endless wave. The storm had rolled in out of nowhere, turning the peaceful drive into a nightmare. His daughter, Lucy, had called him earlier, her voice shaky, saying she was stranded in a small, unfamiliar town. He had jumped into his car without a second thought, racing through the darkness to reach her. "Just hold on, Lucy. I'm coming," Jake whispered to himself, the only sound in the car, aside from the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. The road stretched before him, winding through thick woods. His headlights barely cut through the heavy downpour, and each turn felt more treacherous than the last. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, leaving him to trust his instincts. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure stood by the side of the road, drenched from the rain. Jake's heart skipped a beat. A woman, pale and shivering, stood under a flickering street lamp. Against his better judgment, he slowed down and rolled down the window. "You shouldn't be out here," the woman said, her voice soft, but filled with urgency. Her eyes, wide and haunted, locked with his. "Turn back. There's danger ahead." "What do you mean?" "My daughter is out there. I need to get to her," Jake replied, anxiety bubbling in his chest. The woman didn't blink, her face pale as the moon hidden behind the storm clouds. "There's something in the woods. It's calling for help, but it's not what it seems. Be careful." Before Jake could ask more, she turned and disappeared into the night. Shaken, Jake drove on, the woman's words echoing in his mind. What was she talking about? He didn't have time to figure it out. Lucy needed him. But just as he rounded the next bend, his headlights illuminated something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood in the middle of the road, waving its arms frantically. It looked like a man, soaking wet and calling out for help. "Help me," the voice cried, the sound sharp and desperate. Jake slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. The figure didn't move. Jake's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. He remembered the woman's warning. It's not what it seems. Against his instincts, Jake pressed the gas, swerving around the figure. The man's scream echoed behind him, chilling. But as Jake glanced in the rearview mirror, the road was empty. The figure was gone. "What the hell?" he muttered, heart racing. He was starting to regret ever leaving the house. As Jake drove deeper into the woods, the storm grew worse. The wind howled, shaking the trees, and the rain came down in sheets, making it almost impossible to see. He was about to pull over when the road forked. The left path led into an even darker section of the forest, while the right looked slightly more navigable. Jake hesitated, his fingers tightening on the wheel. Which way? He asked himself, glancing between the two options. A crackle of lightning lit up the sky, revealing a shadow at the edge of the left path. It was that same man, waving again, only this time his face was twisted in agony. Without thinking, Jake sped down the right path. The trees seemed to close in around him as he pressed forward, and every bump in the road felt like the world shaking beneath him. But then, just as his panic reached its peak, the storm suddenly cleared. The rain lightened, and the wind died down. Ahead, he could see the faint lights of a small town. Relief washed over him as he spotted Lucy's car parked at a rundown diner by the side of the road. She was standing outside, waving to him, soaked but safe. "Dad!" she called out, her voice filled with both fear and relief. Jake parked the car and rushed over to her, pulling her into a tight hug. "I'm so glad you're okay," Jake said, his voice shaky. "Let's get out of here." As they climbed into the car, Lucy frowned. "Dad, did you see anyone out there?" "I thought I saw someone watching me from the trees." Jake's heart sank. He didn't want to scare her, but he couldn't ignore what had happened. "Let's just get home. I don't want to stay here any longer." As they drove away, Jake glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. In the distance, under the dim glow of a street lamp, he saw the same woman from earlier, standing still, watching them drive away. Her words echoed in his mind. "There's danger ahead." Jake never drove at night again. Jacob sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The fog had rolled in thick and fast, swallowing up the world around him. His son, Mark, sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window into the murky gray. They were driving down Highway 22, a long stretch of road Jacob had traveled many times before, but tonight something felt wrong. "Dad, how much longer?" Mark asked, his voice cutting through the silence. "Not long, buddy," Jacob replied, trying to keep his tone calm. "Just a few more miles." They had been on the road for hours, heading back from a camping trip. Jacob always enjoyed these trips with Mark. But tonight, the fog was unsettling. It wrapped around their car like a thick blanket, making it hard to see anything beyond the headlights. Suddenly, through the haze, a figure appeared on the side of the road. A woman, dressed in a long white gown, her hair dark and wet, hanging over her face. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. "Do you see that?" Mark asked, sitting up straighter. "I see her," Jacob whispered, slowing the car. As they neared the woman, she turned her head, revealing a pale, ghostly face. Her eyes locked onto Jacob's, and she raised a hand, pointing down the road. "Don't stop, Dad," Mark urged, gripping the armrest. Jacob nodded, pressing down on the gas. But as they passed her, the woman's voice whispered through the fog, "You'll never escape." They drove in silence for what felt like an eternity. Jacob's mind raced. Who was that woman? And what did she mean by those chilling words? His pulse quickened, and his palms grew sweaty against the wheel. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and the fog only thickened. Just as Jacob was about to say something to ease the tension, a faint light appeared through the fog. A gas station. It looked abandoned, but the flickering neon sign above the old pumps glowed dimly. Jacob pulled in, hoping to gather his thoughts and check the map. As they stepped out of the car, the air felt colder, heavier. The station was eerily quiet, and the thick fog seemed to press in on them from all sides. Mark stayed close to his father, his eyes wide with unease. "Dad, I don't like this place," Mark whispered. "I know, buddy," Jacob said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just a quick stop, then we'll get back on the road." Jacob walked toward the station's front door, but it was locked. He turned around, and that's when he saw her, the same woman from the road standing just beyond the pumps, her white gown trailing in the fog. "Dad!" Mark's voice trembled. The woman took a step forward, her mouth opening as a soft, eerie whisper filled the air. "You'll never escape." Panic surged through Jacob. He grabbed Mark's hand and bolted back to the car. He fumbled with the keys, his fingers shaking as he finally got the door open. They jumped in, and Jacob floored the gas, tires screeching as they sped away from the station. But the fog seemed to follow them, thickening even more, making the road ahead nearly impossible to see. Jacob's heart raced as the car's headlights barely cut through the gray void. Then, faint whispers filled the car, soft at first, but growing louder. "You'll never escape," the voice repeated, echoing inside their heads. Jacob's grip on the wheel tightened. "Hang on, Mark. We're getting out of here." Mark sat frozen, fear etched on his face. "What does she want, Dad?" "I don't know," Jacob admitted, his voice strained. "But we're not sticking around to find out." As they sped down the highway, the fog suddenly lifted. The world beyond the windshield cleared, and the open road stretched ahead. Jacob let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. For the first time that night, it felt like they were free. But as the tension began to melt, Mark glanced out the window, his face paling. "Dad," he whispered. Jacob followed his son's gaze. In the rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road behind them, was the woman. Her pale face stared back at them, unmoving, her words ringing in Jacob's ears one last time. "You'll never escape." And as the darkness fades, remember, the real chills linger long after the story's end. Until next time, brave souls.